Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we jump into today's session, I would firstly like to start by acknowledging country and acknowledging the fact that we are all meeting on the lands of First Peoples. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands that you may be joining from as well, and to any other First Nations peoples here. Now, on a day like today, I think it's also important to acknowledge and recognise the contribution that First Nations peoples make and continue to make to Australia's creative industries. And on that note, I'd just like to shout out to the fantastic artist, Alicia Menzel, whose artwork is very proudly displayed on our presentation today. Now, for those who don't know me, my name is Yatu Widders Hunt. I'm a descendant of the Dunghutti and Unawan peoples from northwestern New South Wales. So if anyone knows the city of Tamworth, we're just up the road in Armidale. And that's through my father's side. And through my mother, I also have Irish and English ancestry. I have quite an uncommon name, I guess. It's actually an Aboriginal word. My full name is Yatunka, and it's a Munduljarra word from the Gibson Desert region of Western Australia, which is fast becoming my favourite state. But I was born on Darug country in Western Sydney and now live on Guy Mabel country, beautiful saltwater country on Sydney's northern beaches.
Thank you, Yatu. Hello, everybody. A lot of you know me, but I'm Hannah Sturrock. Sturrock is a Scottish name, perhaps a nickname from sort of Gaelic Sturrock, which means rough and surly in temper, or Storach, which is having broken teeth. Or an older Scots Stur, which means stalwart, strong, and stern and fierce. So let's go with that one, shall we? I was born in Aberdeen, and I have two younger brothers. My dad is Scottish American and my mum English. We moved to Australia when I was 11, first living in Perth, and then Melbourne. I spent 10 years living in London in my 20s and 30s before coming back to Sydney, where I live on Gadigal Wangal country opposite Callum Park in Lilyfield.
Thank you, Hannah and Yatu. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Laura Aldington. I don't think I have anything interesting that I can tell you about my surname. If my accent doesn't give it away, I was born in England. I moved to Australia in my early 20s, so I've been here for almost 25 years. I live on Biddigal land in Bondi. I work on Gadigal land here in Surrey Hills. And I live with my beautiful son, Sammy, and we're so thrilled to have you all here. So thank you so much for joining us. You probably noticed that we introduced ourselves then without talking about what we do and our professional roles. And I think that is quite different. And it's very much part of Aboriginal culture to introduce yourself based on who you are and not what you do. And so we'll come to talk about ways that you might be able to integrate that into some of your meetings, but it's a really interesting and different way to introduce yourself and to sort of get connected with each other. And when we've experimented with doing that in meetings, it does create quite a different culture of connection. And I think we were talking about how interesting it is that sometimes when we have big meetings, we'll do introductions and then we'll do some sort of icebreaker, because I think we all have that kind of innate need to connect. And I think that is really a rich part of Aboriginal culture. So why are we here today? There are so many reasons for us to be sitting here today. And thank you all so much for making the time to join us. I think it's fair to say that diversity has been a hot topic on the industry agenda in the last couple of weeks. I think you have been more than aware of that, I'm sure. And most notably, it's been around gender diversity. Ageism has also had a good look in, which is great. But I think another really important area for us to focus on as businesses is reconciliation. We face a chronic underrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people in our industry. And I think, as the oldest culture on earth, where creativity and storytelling are such a rich part of that community and population, we're really missing an enormous opportunity there. So I think we're feeling like it's really time agencies who haven't yet started to address this, be given some tools and advice on how to get on that journey. And I think it's been just over a year now since the failed Voice referendum. And I think however you voted on that, it was a tough time. 80% of our Indigenous population voted in favour of that. So, a hard week for many last week. And I think it has also meant that after a flurry of engagement and allyship around reconciliation, it can feel a little bit like progress is stalled. And we are keen to unstall it within the industry. And I think and hope that by being here, you're also a person who would like to see some change start to happen. We're also seeing increasingly that a bigger part of tenders for both government and corporate entities, they are already, and they will increasingly begin to ask you as an agency to outline your reconciliation strategy and what you're doing in the space. So aside from it being a beneficial thing to do and the right thing to do, I think failure to be doing anything at all will make it increasingly challenging for businesses to participate in those kind of pitches and RFIs. I think one of the things that we've talked about a lot when we've been prepping for this is that it is a space that feels quite challenging. I think we should just sort of get that out there. And one of the reasons, the central reasons for that we've identified is that there is a bit of fear around doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing or causing offense or not knowing where to start. So I guess we just wanted to allay that fear today. Consider this the safest space you will ever be in to ask any questions that you've got. There's nothing that will be considered too silly, too embarrassing, too feeling like you should know better. Like none of that kind of judgment will be here today. And we've left the chat open so that you can share questions with us as we go, and we'll also have a chance to discuss them at the end. I've had the pleasure of talking to Yatu on many, many occasions, and I think she is one of the kindest and most empathetic people I have ever met, as well as being extremely open and approachable and very knowledgeable. So please don't be afraid to use this moment to kind of ask and learn. You are here because you don't have all the answers and you want to find out more. So that's really, we've designed the session with that in mind. We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff today, but Hannah, in her brilliant usual way of being extremely helpful, is going to share with you afterwards a bunch of links and some of the resources that we'll touch upon, so that you've got the ability to sort of spend a bit of time afterwards looking at some of those things. So if we just sort of flick on the way that we, flick on, sorry, Yatu.
Yeah, I think building on what Laura said, it's really important to frame today's conversation around some principles of reconciliation. We are going to get into some really practical things, but I think that message around not being afraid is a really significant one. I think across our industry, and it's not unique to our industry, across Australia, people are very fearful of stepping into the reconciliation space. Because they're worried that they won't get it right. And we're asked all the time, but what's the right way? What's the right thing to do? And I think we all have to accept that we're not always going to get it right, and we can't always be right, but what we can always be is respectful. And we were talking even yesterday in preparation, even those of us who do have Aboriginal heritage backgrounds, who've grown up in communities, every time we leave our home community, we are quite literally going to another country. So we're going through the same process. We're feeling uncomfortable. We're asking the questions. And again, we may not do it perfectly, but we can always be respectful in the way that we build relationships and make the approach. And I think, as someone that studied public relations at uni and worked in agencies for a long time, we're sort of trained to solve problems. And I think that we've also got to reframe our thinking that reconciliation isn't a problem to be solved. It's a process that we can contribute to and that we can grow from. And these stories and experiences are collective Australian stories and experiences, and we all have both an opportunity and a responsibility to participate. And it's exciting, and it can be really celebratory as well. So I think we've got to also remember that, that there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of issues that confront the sector and this space, but there's also a lot of joy, and there's a lot of creativity, and there's a lot of excitement within First Nations communities and our engagement with the sector in particular. So I think it's just good to have those things in mind as we go through some of the really practical ways that we can either begin to engage or re-engage in the reconciliation movement.
So the way that we've set this session up is we've identified 10 ideas or actions that you can take pretty immediately in your businesses. And we've deliberately designed it to be, you know, the idea that this is just taking a step forward. It's not perfection, it's about progress. And you might be already doing some of these things, and that's great if you are. You might be doing none of them, and that's great if you are. That gives you an opportunity to start doing some of them. But, you know, we're very aware that the to-do lists are long. There are a lot of issues around DE&I that everybody is sort of grappling with. We really wanted to make this an accessible way to start the journey and to start to just think, as Yati said, it's not about ticking stuff off a list and moving on. It's about good intent and beginning a journey that I think will last us our entire careers and probably the generations that come behind us as well. So it's really important that this isn't a kind of functional, you must do all these things by the end of next week and then forget about it, but they are the things that we've identified that can really start you on the journey, and they're pretty simple, they're hopefully pretty affordable, and they are things that you could start doing tomorrow. So please do feel free, as I said, to jump into the chat. And I did mean to say, if there's anything that you want to ask that you just think, oh, I don't want to ask it in this environment, I hope you feel you can, but if you can't, then Yatu has very kindly offered to share her email address with you also. If there's something that's a burning question that you feel like you want to ask her directly, then of course you can do that after the session. So we're going to kick off by talking about putting Indigenous owned businesses into your supply chain. And I think when people talk about working with more Indigenous owned businesses, they tend to immediately default to production companies and animators and the people that we work with to make our output. And I think that is really important, but there are a heap of other ways that you can start to engage Indigenous businesses outside of that as well. And just thinking about all of the different partners and suppliers that you work with within your businesses, there are many great Indigenous owned businesses that you can start to support in that. So for example, you might have a caterer that caters your meetings. There's beautiful Indigenous caterers that can, you know, become your partners on that. You might have a florist, depending on the size and scale of your agency, that regularly puts flowers in your office. Again, beautiful Indigenous florists. And from cleaning companies to all of the people that help run your office and make it what it is, there are so many businesses that you can be talking to. And if you're not familiar with Supply Nation, I definitely recommend that you hop online and have a look at that resource, because that has about 4,500 registered Indigenous businesses that you can search by category, by geography, to really see some shortlists of some great organizations that you can start to talk to and engage around all aspects of the way that you show up and do business. So I definitely encourage you, and we'll put that link in the notes afterwards for you to check that out and start thinking about whether you can start to replace some of your existing partners with some new businesses that are Indigenous owned.
Yati, you had a good tip for a gin, which I thought, I mean, that's perfect for advertising, right?
That's right. There's a Green Ant Gin, which I think is produced in South Australia, which is an Aboriginal owned business. So yeah, as Laura mentioned, there's a lot of stereotypes around what Aboriginal businesses are doing, but it is incredibly diverse and varied. So definitely encourage you to hop on Supply Nation. The next one is also a bit of a hot topic, because we talk about the underrepresentation, as Laura mentioned before, First Nations peoples in our industry, specifically where there's often overrepresentation in some other creative industries. So internships are often top of mind: how to attract First Nations candidates, how to offer internships that are meaningful, that support the person and also benefit the business. And we just wanted to flag that, you know, this is absolutely a great way to address some of these issues of creating practical pathways into the industry. But we see quite often organisations trying to create an internship program from scratch with perhaps no Indigenous staff in the organisation and perhaps not much experience of working with First Nations candidates. But the great news is that there's you know, there are models and programs that have already been developed for organisations to sign up to engage with First Nations interns. So I encourage you to get on Google and have a look, but certainly the one that we have worked with in our business, and I know is quite common in a lot of workplaces, is Career Trackers. So they identify students at the tertiary level, they set up relationships. You know, if it works out, the idea is that you build a relationship with that student who might intern with you once or twice a year for the duration of their degree, and build knowledge about your business and build that relationship. And I think the great thing about engaging with a pre-approved program is that there's a lot of concern around the support that we're offering to the student as well, and to the business, and upskilling ourselves. So programs like that actually have built-in mechanisms that make sure that the student is supported, and also make sure that the business is supported and provided with the right tools and supports in that scenario. And the other thing that might be interesting to consider if you don't engage in a pre-approved program is to actually co-create one with a First Nations partner. So we're often sitting in boardrooms trying to fix this all by ourselves, but there's a wealth of Aboriginal organisations, businesses, First Nations student units at universities, at TAFEs, at cultural centres like National Centre of Indigenous Excellence here in Sydney. I'm not far from Redfern at the moment. That you can actually co-create something that makes sure there's Indigenous expertise and skills built into that design. So there are absolutely easier ways to engage in internship programs.
Okay, next up, cultural awareness or capability training. I'm not sure if any of you have ever participated in this. I highly recommend it. I think as a way of just starting the journey of understanding and listening and hearing about the experience of First Nations people, the history, the stories, the cultures, the things that are important, you know, some of the things that you might want to think about engaging in, and then some of the areas to, you know, be more mindful around. It is a brilliant way to kind of fast track your knowledge and understanding and build confidence actually around the whole space. So there are a couple of different partners. The ACA have done training in the past with an organization called Black Card, which I have also undergone, and it's absolutely fantastic. They run a whole range of different sessions from 90 minutes to 3 hours to things in between. They will, you know, run training on things like acknowledgements of country and how to do those quickly and the meaning behind them. So I really think that as a starting point, if your senior leaders haven't done cultural awareness or capability training, I definitely recommend that that's the first step that you take, because it will just open up a whole world of possibilities in terms of how you can engage more confidently in the space and just learn heaps. And as Yatu said, it's, you know, I think it can, some of the training is quite confronting that I did. It sort of really does give you pause for thought. I remember feeling afterwards like it took me a little while to kind of come back around from some of the stories and things that were shared in it, but there's also huge joy in it, a huge understanding of how beautiful and wonderful this culture is, and the benefits of engaging with it more fully. So again, we'll put some links in for you guys of some of the partners that we would recommend as a starter for 10. It's not a complete list, and there's lots of providers of it, but there's a couple that we have at least had experience of that we think are really good.
Great. Well, the next one is really about building relationships. And I think those of you who do have a reconciliation action plan, or who have had one, or who have even done some of the training that Laura was talking about, will know how significant relationship building is as part of the process with First Nations communities. So this is just a really simple thing. It sounds really basic, but it can actually be quite impactful and show a lot of respect as well. So some of our clients, particularly those who work across Australia, who might have offices based in different parts of the country, who are looking to partner in those areas, or who may, you know, for instance, be a media company and have assets in those areas as well, are simply starting to do things like writing a letter to their local land council or cultural authority, which again, you can Google or use the local council as a resource as well. They usually have pretty good contact lists, and simply introduce yourself and say, hey, this is who we are. We work on your country. We're based on your country. This is what we do. And we'd love to be in touch. And through that, quite organically, things happen. We've seen things happen like suddenly people have meetings and learn more about each other. And that's where you might start to consider what kinds of partnerships, whether it be an internship program, whether it be a local initiative, whether it be a knowledge exchange, whether you might engage that land council to do cultural awareness training that's really unique to that part of the country that that particular office is in. We had one client send a letter to explain that there were assets going up in the community that they wanted to reference Aboriginal language and show respect. And that actually built a relationship with the board of that organisation, who were really excited to engage, who had their own ideas of how to amplify Aboriginal culture through the work that that business was doing. So something as simple as showing respect to say, we know we're here, we know we're on your land, we'd like to get to know you, and we're here if you'd like to get to know us, can really drive outcomes, relationships, and just build a good understanding within that community.
And I won't dwell on this one for too long because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You heard Yatu at the beginning of this meeting acknowledge country. It's a really simple thing that you can do at the beginning of any all agency gathering. We have it as a sign off on email signatures. I think it's a really respectful thing to put in the front of any RFIs or significant presentations that you're doing. It's not tricky to do. There's heaps of examples of acknowledgements of country that you can read about on Reconciliation Australia's website. And, you know, the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with the language. And I think as an absolute minimum, I think taking a minute to just acknowledge the land that you're on, the land that the people that are joining your meeting are on, and paying your respects to their elders past and present and emerging is a simple way to show respect. And as you know, I think Yatu said, you can't always have all the answers. You can always be respectful and acknowledge country. So we definitely encourage you to make that a part of your sort of routine business practice if it's not already.
The next one is really around acknowledging significant dates and events, and it's something that we do sort of naturally around other industry dates and events on public holidays and other things. So we encourage, and we see a lot of agencies and organisations actually create a calendar of events that includes significant dates in the First Nations calendar. And again, some of them, you know, actually days of reflection, and they might reflect on things that perhaps are difficult, like January 26, for instance. Black Lives Matter movement, for instance. So it's really about taking the time to acknowledge that they're happening, because I know it can feel really uncomfortable to talk about, but it doesn't have to be big public statements or media releases. It can simply be a respectful acknowledgement within the business, with your staff, an email from your leaders. We're now seeing a lot of agencies actually provide January 26 as a day of optional work for people who don't recognise it as a public holiday, and provide an alternative day off in something like NAIDOC Week, Reconciliation Week, or perhaps another day of cultural significance to that person or that team. So I think, yeah, sometimes when things get a little tricky, we often retreat, but there's a lot of power in truth-telling, acknowledging, showing respect, talking to your teams, and providing support to people as we navigate through significant dates. That sort of leads quite nicely into the next one, because there are a lot of significant dates that are absolutely celebratory, and there's a fantastic opportunity to showcase the work that you as businesses are doing, but also to showcase the work that is happening within First Nations communities. It's probably not widely known, but October, so the month that we're in at the moment, is actually Indigenous Business Month. So it's a whole month-long event of webinars, events, you know, sort of supplier events as well, to connect with potential clients and agencies, as a way for us all to pause and recognise the contribution of First Nations businesses to the broader business community. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in the Australian business community, which is super exciting. So I think taking pause to celebrate those moments, we're good at celebrating wins and awards, but we also need to look around and celebrate exciting moments that we as Australians, people who live and work in Australia on Aboriginal land with Aboriginal people, can actually lean in and celebrate. So I think that's something that we can all be mindful of. And there's a couple of big dates you would all be familiar with. Reconciliation Week and NAIDOC Week are the two probably most well-known ones, but I encourage you to also have a look around at ones that might be happening in your community, and some of the lesser known ones like Indigenous Business Month that provide a great opportunity to talk about some positive stories.
Now, this one is probably the most obvious sort of output of a lot of the work that we're doing, is to hopefully inspire people to get started on their own reconciliation action plan. So this step is to maybe just to encourage everyone not to overthink it and worry about not being ready, but just to kind of start diving in and understanding the steps that are involved in getting started on a RAP. So there are 4 RAP types: reflect, innovate, stretch, and elevate. most people on this webinar, I would imagine, are either thinking about starting a Reflect RAP, or they have a Reflect RAP and maybe thinking about moving on to an Innovate RAP. Now, those 4 types of RAPs, they allow wherever you are on the journey, honestly, like wherever you are, from absolutely 0 to hero, there is ways for you to develop your commitments on a continuous basis. So the Reflect RAP, there's lots of information on Reconciliation Australia's website, but just so to sort of clarify, the Reflect RAP is really about getting you prepared to engage in reconciliation meaningfully. The sort of things that you would need to do is to commit to engaging staff and leadership in understanding the importance of reconciliation, develop some relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stakeholders, and scoping kind of where your organisation can best and legitimately have impact in your sphere of influence. So a Reflect RAP does not necessarily mean you're expected to make changes to policies or internal operations. And a Reflect RAP is implemented over 12 to 18 months. Once you have the general sort of support and governance structure in place and you have a Reflect RAP, you can start thinking about an Innovate RAP. And that's really getting more into sort of the actions that you need to take to achieve your organization's unique vision for reconciliation, which might mean it's a deeper understanding of your sphere of influence and really establishing those best approaches to advance reconciliation. And an Innovate RAP is implemented over another 2 years. So with Reflect and Innovate, you've got approximately 4 years of work there. None of this is something that can be done quickly and sort of in a perfunctory way. It's time and understanding and just gradually working on something is key. Reconciliation Australia also run regular free webinars that you can register for to further explain the process. And of course, ACA can also support you on your RAP journey. We've got lots of resources available on our member resource hub. If anyone is unfamiliar with that or hasn't logged in and needs a password, just let us know. But we have got lots of great resources, fact sheets and templates available for members. We also have Indigenous consultants that we can link you with if you would like to engage them. But as I always say to members when they're sort of asking me how do we do it? What's the steps? I always say, look, number 1, engage your RAP working group internally. Then ask everyone in the working group to watch our launch webinar that's on the website for some background. Do an internal audit around your motivation and readiness to start the RAP journey. Spend some time kind of exploring and getting clear on this. Read the members guide and fact sheets. Do the workshop prep that we have provided a template for. And once you're at that stage, you may want to then engage an Indigenous consultant to come and maybe help or attend a workshop with you.
Great. This one is really around the work. I guess we've talked a lot about the organizational structure and the types of behaviors and rituals and activities that you can implement. But as Laura mentioned, we're increasingly seeing through pitches, through tenders, particularly from government and corporate organizations, around the need to demonstrate an understanding of First Nations audiences, insights, media consumption habits and those kinds of things. And there's a lot of briefs and projects that would actually benefit from First Nations perspectives when we're looking at things like moving to the net zero economy, looking at sustainability, all of these things that First Nations people have significant expertise in and can contribute heavily to. So I think the main action here is really to simply, as part of your process, ask yourself the question, when you receive a brief or a new email or a pitch opportunity, could this brief benefit from First Nations insights or partnering with a First Nations creative agency, people who might have lived experience of that issue. So sometimes, and I know we all live in very busy environments, and we all get time pressure that are sometimes not particularly realistic, but it's really about doing that at the beginning of the process rather than at the end of the process, like the day before the pitch is due, and hurriedly trying to find someone who may be able to assist or provide insight. So it's really just asking ourselves that question right at the beginning, and thinking about it in the same way that you'd think about any other type of expertise. When we might prepare a pitch, we might have to engage a designer to help us do that. So we engage them in a professional procurement. You might need an animator. So it's thinking about this expertise as expertise that helps win the work, makes the work better, and can actually drive the project forward. So some of the ways we as an Aboriginal agency have been engaged with other agencies, for instance, is we've been engaged and paid to participate in a pitch process. So a pitch is a consortia. So we bring that expertise and help to influence some of the mainstream activity as well. So we're more in a partnership model, and we pitch together. We sometimes help agencies design what the First Nations governance model of their project might be going forward. So should they win, how do they make sure that they're sense checking with First Nations communities? Is there a First Nations advisory group that helps to drive the creative? Is there a First Nations group of people with lived experience of that issue who review and check the creative or the approach? So there's lots of ways of doing it. And there's lots of agencies, as Hannah mentioned, out there. We're all on Supply Nation. There may be people in your local community or even your business that you can talk to, but it's really about thinking about our First Nations peoples, critical to could we benefit from engagement as part of this brief project pitch, and then taking it from there.
Great. And the last one is really around just getting out into community and supporting your teams to do the same thing. So we were talking the other day about how there are just so many great events, things happening in your local area. They're kind of hidden in plain sight. They are on websites. They are easy to find through just Googling what's going on, contacting your local land council. But I think, if you're at the point where you are more engaged in this and you're holding reconciliation events in your agency, it might be better to take that out of your agency and go and build some relationships. And I think Yati's touched on that a few times in what she's been saying around, it's just about building relationships, right? It's a very relational culture, and there doesn't always have to be an outcome. There doesn't always have to be an agenda. Sometimes it can just be getting out and meeting people, and you never know what that might take. That might be helpful in a year. It might never be helpful. It's all just about having those conversations and building those relationships so that you start to build your own network of people that you can reach out to and continue the reconciliation journey with them. So it's easy to find that stuff. There's loads of it. I think a commitment to going out and attending a couple of those events each year and getting your teams to do the same is another great first step.
Just makes everything easier, doesn't it? Once you've actually got some people in your sort of little black book of friends, allies, contacts that you can ask, consult, chat to easily whenever you have a question.
Yeah. So look, I think the principle that we've tried to land here, is that it doesn't have to be this overwhelming task where you have to end up being the most experienced, knowledgeable person on this issue before you can really start anything. And I think as an industry, we tend to think if we don't have all the answers, we don't have any of the answers, but actually progress, not perfection, right? If you were doing those 10 things in your business, you were already on the path to reconciliation. You're already doing a lot of the things that are required as part of the Reflect Wrap process. And, hopefully you can see that they don't cost really anything in terms of time and resource. They're just ways that you can integrate some of this thinking into the way that you're already doing business. And some of you might feel like you're doing a lot of them already. Some of you might have learned about a couple of things that you can do to improve what you're doing. And some of you might go, wow, I don't do any of these things. And wherever you're joining this conversation, that's totally fine. That's why you're here. It would be awesome if you guys had questions, because you don't get the opportunity to sort of sit with someone as experienced as Yatu very often. I think it would be great if there are any things that still feel a bit unclear, or there's any sort of things you've always wanted to ask or always wanted to know. Now's definitely the opportunity. to get in there. So pop your questions in the chat if there's anything that you want us to talk about a bit more or clarify or dig a bit deeper into. I might kick off with one question that's just popped in. Can you explain a bit more about career trackers and how they might help identify a grad or intern and how an agency might engage with them?
Yeah, for sure. And just wanted to, I guess caveat that I'm speaking from our experience as a business working with career trackers. But usually the process that we've been through, that I know a lot of businesses go through, is you actually have someone inside the organization who works with you. You can brief them on the type of skills and experience that you're interested in. They have a really good relationship with a lot of the universities across the city, so they're not limited. They have license to tap into a larger talent pool. So we might meet with them, say, look, we want someone who's got a really strong health background, who maybe comes out of a sociology department, or types of things that we think might be valuable to our business, and they help us identify candidates who would be suitable. And then you can actually meet with, have an informal interview discussion with those candidates and understand whether your business also aligns with their aspirations as well. So it's a pretty standard sort of process, but you absolutely have support, and you also have the ability to have a dialogue and identify the types of things that you might need in your agency to support a particular skills gap or to support the work that you're delivering.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come in is around Supply Nation, and does it include suppliers in the comm space like PR agencies, production companies, talent businesses?
Yeah, Supply Nation has everything. So it's kind of our little directory of Black businesses. So they do have all kinds of businesses. Yeah, as Hannah mentioned, it could be a cleaning service, construction business, video production company, sole trader animators, lawyers, everything. Well, that is probably the most comprehensive database. We should also point out that there are generally in most states and territories, First Nations chambers of commerce, who are also a great resource in your area. If you're particularly interested, in connecting with them, they may also be a great resource. But it's very broad, wide, and diverse list of Indigenous business.
Okay, this is a great question, interesting one for us to get into. Have you seen a shift in companies putting RAPs in a holding pattern or shifting it lower down on their priority list due to changes in political feeling after the Voice referendum? Like, what impact do you think that has had on Australian businesses? It's probably a question for both of you, actually, in terms of member agencies and businesses that you're engaging with, Yatu.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's probably been a bit of a mixed response, to be honest. I think there are a number of organizations who have leaned in and continued their commitment, but I do think it's probably a fair comment that we have seen some organizations perhaps de-invest or not invest as heavily in some of their First Nations initiatives or in the broader Reconciliation Action Plan movement following the referendum. I think some of that also comes back to fear. People are scared or concerned about what to do. Is it okay to continue on? Is it okay to keep talking about these issues? So I think, certainly from my point of view and from some of the, communities that we talk to, it's almost more important than ever that these issues stay relevant to the industry and stay relevant to Australians, because as we know, the referendum was not successful. We don't have a constitutionally enshrined voice that can speak to Parliament. But if we all supported that movement or believe in the reconciliation principles, we should continue to embed that in our own businesses, in our own practices, and keep these issues top of mind, advocate, create space for First Nations voices. But yeah, I do think there's been a lot of confusion and perhaps a slight retreat from the movement in the past 12 months.
I think that's a great point as well with any of these initiatives that don't really have a finish line. There isn't a great, we won that pitch, we won that referendum, like done. It's a different way of thinking, and it can be, I want to say sometimes it's relentless because it will never be finished. But once you've kind of wrapped your head around that, and you integrate the principles of reconciliation or the principles of sustainability or the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion into how your business just rolls, then it's sort of just like performance reviews. It's just like onboarding new staff. It's something that you do as a kind of the fabric of running a business rather than a finite campaign or tactic that you kind of implement and then complete.
Yeah, great question. So someone else has asked, what's the best way to get people in the business to join the RAP committee or First Nations committee?
I always say with committees, getting people to join, I'd probably just encourage you to invite and share what the committee is, what kind of initiatives the committee will probably be looking at, and really clearly saying we would love people who are interested in this, passionate about it, curious about it, to put their hand up and join our working group. So almost just putting more of an invitation out with a bit of context rather than saying, you know, we need you to sign up to this extracurricular activity.
Yeah, I also wonder if sometimes like starting with the committee that you need to join is not the most, it's not always the most motivating start point, but I think inviting someone to undertake the cultural capability training will naturally make them want to join your committee and, do more in the space, because their knowledge and passion for the subject and experience will absolutely come to life when they start to engage in the topic more broadly. And I think committees sometimes feel like, well, that's just work and I've got to kind of do more stuff outside of my day job. Whereas actually the starting of the go to an event, build that first relationship, be the who wants to write to the Land Council and introduce ourselves, like how do we start the journey? And then you can form a committee around the people that are naturally most engaged with it, but starting with the joy, I think, of it and the benefit of it, because I think, as Yatu said, we can focus a lot on the issues, and there are challenges and around the topic, but it's also so fun and so great to be doing the work. So I definitely encourage starting maybe there before you get people doing extracurricular work. Speaking of cultural capabilities training, someone has asked about the Black Card training. How do we get in touch with them? Are they on the ACA website? We're certainly going to put their details into the email that you'll all receive after this session, so you can access that.
We did go through about 2 years ago. We used to run actual sort of dedicated workshops just for ACA members, and we got a lot of people through the training that way. And then we found that it was just getting a little bit harder to find that minimum number all in one workshop to mount one with Black Cards. So we tend to now just direct you to Black Cards website, because they have so many options to register for ongoing workshops via Zoom. And you can just do one person from your agency can attend rather than having to get 20 together. And then Miri Miri is another one where we recommend, and they have a lot of e-learning on demand as well. So there's various ways to engage in that training.
I think it's also, definitely endorse Black Card and Miri Miri as well. They're fantastic. There's probably others if you on Supply Nation or more local based ones. I think also there's other opportunities outside of the cultural capability training. There's lots of like cultural tourism operators, smaller businesses that are offering experiences. So we know cultural capability training sometimes only happens once a year, but like for instance, when we moved to a premises, our former office down in near the Rocks, we actually undertook Auntie Margaret Campbell's Dreamtime X tours and did a 2-hour walk around the harbour to learn a little bit more about harbour history from her knowledge about where we were. So there's also other ways you can continue to keep up that learning and engagement throughout the year, in addition to some of that formal training that would also encourage you to look into.
Yeah, great call. It's sort of definitely not one and done with cultural capability training, and keep going, keep learning.
Some great sort of questions coming in now. So someone's asked, apologies for a basic question, but can you please explain terminology for me? Aboriginal versus Indigenous versus First Nations. I'm not sure what is most appropriate.
Oh, this is always a very common question. And I will probably start by saying that none of those terms are, quote, wrong. So I use terms like Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, First Nations quite regularly. I would say probably the term First Nations is something that's probably quite commonly used across Australia and in communities. But again, like anything, we always just ask how people like to be identified. Some people don't like the term Aboriginal. They like to be identified by the name of their particular clan or nation. Some people don't like the term Indigenous because it's, historically for various reasons, one of which might be because it's been historically used to describe, plants or other things. So everybody has their own preference. I don't think any of them are wrong. And again, even as people like I identify as Aboriginal, I will ask people when I go to a new community, well, what would be the most appropriate way to identify this person? Or I'm going to introduce this person. How would you like to be identified? And they'll just tell you.
Sort of similar sort of question around what is the sentiment behind acknowledging elders in particular? I've heard it's no longer appropriate to acknowledge emerging elders, and I'd love some understanding on this.
Oh yeah, this is another one that's come up because you will recall if you've heard quite a few acknowledgements, you would have heard the phrase elders past, present, and emerging. And again, it's not that emerging is necessarily wrong, but there was some commentary from some parts of the community, and again, we're a very diverse community, so I want to speak for all of Aboriginal people, but emerging just felt like for some people a bit of a funny concept because there's not like, a pathways program to becoming an elder. So it's a very significant cultural role that you achieve at a certain point in your life, or you may be asked to undertake, or that you assume at a certain point in your life. So yeah, the more commonly used phrase now is past, present, and future. So people who in the future will become elders. It's just, felt like a little bit of a Western concept that, you're kind of coming up through the ranks rather than acknowledging the cultural concept, which is that it's a role that you assume at the right time based on the protocols in your community. But again, I don't think people are going to take great offense if you do use that term. It's just some feedback that we've had from communities around the nuances of the language.
See, I didn't know that. That's so great. What a great learning for anyone who's doing acknowledgements of country. Okay, so in some meetings, everyone who speaks seems to start by offering a personal acknowledgement of country. Is there a standard approach?
I would say normally we work on the protocol that whoever chairs the meeting or opens the meeting does an acknowledgement, and it wouldn't necessarily be a requirement of other people in the meeting to do an acknowledgement as well. But of course, if they wish to, or they felt like they wanted to, that would also be encouraged. But in terms of a standard process, I think that would be appropriate, that whoever's hosting the meeting would be more than appropriate. There is sometimes a bit of a default around trying to see if there's an Aboriginal person in the room who wants to do the acknowledgement, but I think it's just really important, and that's okay to ask as well if you did want to ask that question. But it's also important to note that for those of us who aren't from that country and don't have the responsibility of performing a welcome, even if we are from that country, we also can only perform acknowledgements. So it's also absolutely okay for non-Indigenous people to perform acknowledgements, even if there are Aboriginal people present in the room. And in fact, it's actually really cool to see non-Indigenous people perform acknowledgements and show respect to country and embrace this ritual and carry on this tradition.
Another question on acknowledgements. Should I start first with the land I'm on, and then can I reference where I descended?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would normally reference the land that you're on first, because that's what we're showing respect to at that time. But ways of personalizing it, making it meaningful to you, meaningful to everyone in the room, is really nice to share, as we did earlier, with the countries we may have been born in, the countries that we may feel connected to, and the country that we live on now.
I've had some great ones where people do just add that little bit of like personal context to what they do love about country, whether it's walking, bushwalking, the waterways, where they walk their dogs, swimming, a little fun fact. I mean, it just gives it that little bit more authenticity than just repeating a sort of a speech that is the same every time. But you know, just an idea. If you know, if creativity strikes, it's not compulsory, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think if you are wondering what to say, there are great examples online that you can find through Reconciliation Australia that can just give you some language to kind of get you started, so you're not feeling the pressure of, you know, it being a sort of big moment. It should be something that you feel really confident to do without having to sort of rehearse it too much. And, you know, if there's a meeting where it feels appropriate and you're chairing that meeting, having some language that you can easily kind of call to mind to do it is easier, I think. Yes, I think this is a great question, actually, and I sort of went through this process. What is the best resource to find the land you're on? It can be confusing with local councils that could sometimes have disparate answers.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. And I think it is messy sometimes. And particularly in East Coast communities, it can be messy because we're the site of invasion. So there is a lot of knowledge that's lost. There's a lot of boundaries that are simply not known. And absolutely and naturally, there is confusion and sometimes disputes about those boundaries and about custodianship of particular places. So yeah, I mean, I do the same thing as well. I ring local land councils, check local council websites. And again, there are confusing areas, but if you don't know, or you think saying a particular term may cause offense to people in the room, it is also okay to do a general acknowledgement and acknowledge that you are on Aboriginal land and you respect and acknowledge the custodians of that land. And it should also be acknowledged that sometimes the advice changes, and that's okay. In some states, we have very different processes of how to determine those boundaries, and that might change. Even where I live in northern Sydney, when I'm not culturally from Sydney, when I moved back to Sydney maybe 10 years ago, I actually just rang the Aboriginal Heritage Office because I was confused myself. And they said, yeah, there's not a lot known about some parts of this area. We encourage you to use the term saltwater peoples, because it's more inclusive and encompassing. And now we're in a place where we can use different terminology. So even myself, I ring them once a year, check in and say, hey, just wanted to check in on what the best and most appropriate way to acknowledge this country is based on the advice of the local community.
Yeah. It's interesting as well. We were talking about it when we were sort of putting this webinar together around, that isn't actually unusual, is it? Like if you think about the way that we travel to other countries and things change and the names of those countries might change, or things that were appropriate 20 years ago are less appropriate now. And I think what I've learned from Yatu is you can just ask, you can just say, I'm struggling a bit to understand this. Can I ask your advice on it or opinion on it? And just like you would in any other place where you were engaging with a culture that was different to your own, you sort of just are willing to learn and be open-minded about it. And I think we talked a lot about good intent is a big part of, you know, you being respectful, you're trying to learn, you're trying to understand. And in my experience, almost all of the people that I've ever sort of engaged and asked questions of have been happy to answer them and, you know, share their knowledge and experience. But it's not an uncommon thing to find that there's certain language in our culture that has changed and evolved, and things that we used to say we don't say anymore, and vice versa. And so it's not an unusual thing, that it's not a fixed static thing. It will evolve and change with time. So just about asking the questions and being curious about the answers, I guess.
Yeah, I think we all need to be very willing to acknowledge our ignorance and just be fine with that and be like, you know, I know this is quite a foreign feeling to be utterly ignorant, but it's okay. And all of those steps in the reflect wrap really do sort of say, like, you know, embrace your ignorance, just shut up and listen for a minute. Don't try and like jump to the solution and this is what the thing's going to be. Just kind of go into the like, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that either. And maybe I'll go and ask some questions. Maybe someone can teach me about this land, you know, and you go back to being a really sort of open-minded student again. And then once you've done some of that work, I'm imagining some of these questions that come up won't be so oblique anymore, because you'll be like, oh, well, when we went with Auntie Margaret on the walk, she told me about this land and kind of where it all, some of the stories. And now I know that now. So it kind of takes it away from being such an academic pursuit in a way.
So I think we're almost at time. Did anyone have one last question they wanted to?
Looks like we've answered everybody's questions, but yeah, the email will go out afterwards with some links. And as Laura said at the beginning, Yatu is happy for you to email her with any others that come up. We have Indigenous consulting services that you can access. Professor Shane Hearn from Culture Link Consulting, he does some wonderful work. He ran a beautiful yarning circle with some of our members in WA, which kind of really looked at some of those practices that can actually help with creative ideation and working together as a team. And this webinar will be recorded as well. It is recorded and will be up on our member resource hub in the next few days. So if there's people in your team that you think should actually watch this, maybe as part of your working group kickoff, this will be accessible for all members in the coming days too.
Yeah, and just thank you to Yatu, I'm sure on behalf of everybody on the call. Your grace and patience and openness and kindness is such a huge asset to this conversation and our industry, and we're so grateful for you giving up your time to share all of that with everybody on it. We'd love you to share any feedback you've got on the session with Hannah, because we're probably going to run it again at some point if there's great feedback or things you think we could have added or spent more time on or whatever that is, then it's all really helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, there'll be more there will definitely be more options for members in 2025, but we really wanted to reset the foundations again. And then, you know, once you kind of all feel that you're comfortable and have got a plan, then, you know, there'll be additional workshops and things that we'll be running. But yeah, do always feel free to email hello@AdCouncil, or and we will get back to you and help you out. Thank you so much, Yatu and Laura. Been brilliant. Thank you for everybody who's come along today as well. I know it's always hard to give up an hour of your day in the middle, but hopefully it's been really helpful and useful and interesting for anyone who tuned in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.